All right, we're sitting in Orlando, Florida on Saturday, July 14th with U.S. Senate candidate Colonel Mike McCalister. Mr. McCalister, thank you for agreeing to do the interview. You are not new to politics. You're actually running for the U.S. Senate nomination on the Republican Party here in the Florida primary on August 14th, which is 1 month from today. You ran in 2010 for governor against Rick Scott. Give me a little bit of personal background about you, outside of the fact that you're retired military.
Well, I had multiple careers. I mean, I was in the military for a total of 33 years. I was in the Guard, I was in the Reserves, I was active duty, but I was a single parent, custodial parent also. So a big part of my life was raising my son when I became the single custodial parent when he was age 4. And I've had a career in civilian employment as well. I have a small tree farm over in Hillsborough County. I have a Florida nursery license. I've taught college for many years. I was an adjunct professor for several schools in the MBA program. I've sat on doctoral thesis committees. I've chaired research on outsourcing, offshoring the global economy. So I kind of have a background that covers a lot of different pieces.
I want to be fair with you in this interview the way I try to be with everyone. And with other candidates, I've asked them to try to distinguish between the differences with each other, with their opponents. I understand that you don't feel comfortable doing that you think the issues before the voters are actually more important.
Well, I think what happens is, particularly in a primary, everyone's trying to win the primary, so they look and try to find things that they can take and twist or spin or whatever and say, oh wow, look at this. I'll give you an example. I wrote a book a couple years ago. I wrote the book before I ever ran for office. The book, no one mentions this much, my opponents, was endorsed by 50 highly credentialed practicing subject matter experts in the fields of business, the economy, education. One of the things, I'll give you an example in the book, and I've had people ask me, is I'm a big 10th Amendment individual. I believe if the U.S. Constitution doesn't give a particular authority specifically to the federal government, then it belongs to the states and the individuals. I would like to see them reverse Roe Wade, get it out of the federal government. I would like to see abortion. My first choice would be for it to be a state issue under 10th Amendment. But I did sign the Personhood Amendment for us to put on the Florida ballot to let us at the state level abolish abortion. So, sometimes when you're trying to do what you feel is the right thing, but you want to do it at the state level instead of the federal level, then people say, oh wow, look at this, look at that. So, that's one reason why I don't really like to talk about other candidates, because we end up taking things out of context and trying to twist it and spin it for our own personal gain, which isn't going to solve any of our nation's problems whatsoever. So instead of talking about candidates, I prefer to talk about issues, our problems, and the realization that there's global threats attacking our country every day. Our problems aren't just internal. 95% of the world does not live in the United States of America, and yet we're competing with them economically, competing with them militarily, competing with them politically, and we just have to take a look at all of those issues.
All right, you said that things get taken out of context, and you brought up your book. Something that's become an issue in this campaign, at least with all of the candidates, even the Tea Parties that have gotten involved and started pushing one candidate over the other, is people's positions on this Agenda 21. You have the West Orlando Tea Party promoting Connie Mack in the last 2 weeks, talking about how Representative Mack is solidly against Agenda 21 and has actually voted against anything that could promote it when that's not necessarily the case. What is Agenda 21? Why is it important in this campaign cycle? I think it's unfortunate when candidates try to take a stand that they're
they're the only one against Agenda 21. I don't know in that particular case what that campaign said. I don't know, and that's not why I'm here today. Agenda 21 is something that I've become aware of in probably the last year and a half or 20 months, let's say. And now that I understand it better, this is happening with everyone. If you went back 3 years ago, very few people had heard of Agenda 21 3 years ago. I referenced the book I wrote again, and the book was published 2 years ago, but I started writing it probably 3 years ago. It takes almost a year to really write a book, get it edited, get it published, and particularly to get it endorsed by 50 experts. What I don't like about, a lot of things I don't like about Agenda 21. It's a one world government concept, kind of has a UN focus, let's call it, or UN initiative driver, and we certainly must stop it. But this is, for one candidate or one individual or whatever, one organization to say we're the anti-Agenda 21 is really not true. Even the Republican National Committee has taken a stand against Agenda 21. My understanding is you have states that are passing laws to stop Agenda 21. So I think anyone that's conservative understands today, or in the last 12 to 18 months, that we have to stop Agenda 21. And it's a bad, it's a huge blow to our national sovereignty, the one world government concept. We start looking at how it gets implemented. The Senate never ratified that treaty, so it was put into, we'll call it motion by executive order under Bill Clinton. It's my understanding, with probably the best way to explain what did that. But the money's come in often at the county level, and even county commissioners are often approached with Agenda 21 monies. Now, what else makes this a complicated issue is they're very sly about this. And they hide behind terms that before we all knew about Agenda 21 were accepted industry terms. They talk about sustainability. Well, in the past, sustainability from a military standpoint was your capability to continue your operations tempo even under enemy opposition. Or in industry, sustainability was your company's ability to maintain a competitive presence in market share. So they hide behind terms that we all had known and accepted in other arenas, and now those terms, when we're looking at Agenda 21, are taking on a different meaning. But I think it's very unfair if someone has dealt in an industry that has nothing to do with the one world government, or particularly in years past, and they use words that were industry standards then, to go back and say, wow, see, they said that there, this is what that means today. That's taking things out of context and applying a retrospective viewpoint to it, and it's just not right. What we need to realize is in industry, they don't always mean, if they say sustainability Agenda 21. We just got to educate everybody better. I know some of the Tea Parties in Florida asked me about a year and a half ago to go to Miami one day on an Agenda 21 issue, and it was Steve Hunter and some of the Ocala Tea Party people. So we went down there, and if I remember right, this was a year and a half ago, and we went out to the property of an individual that actually had come under, shall we say, scrutiny and threats by Durham, which was a county agency down there that was unfunded, and their only means of revenue were permits and fines. So I went out to the property with the Tea Party group, and the gentleman, I asked him to see his tax records, and what they had done is come to him and said, you can't live here, or you can't grow products here, or whatever. We've decided this is a wetland. Well, I had spent a couple years in the Florida Guard in the environmental office there, and in that job, one of my main responsibilities was to inspect the Florida National Guard armories, just to make sure that there weren't things that the Department of Environmental Protection could come in and fine the National Guard. It's like revenue generation. It's like having speed traps or something that aren't a public safety, that's a revenue source. So I asked the gentleman to see his tax records, and sure enough, in my little, where I live, I have a little tree farm over there. Part of my property is actually deeded wetland, and I can't touch it, I can't do anything to it, but it's taxed at like $500 assessment value. Part of it's agricultural and part of it's residential. But all of those are that is marked on the deed of the property if I wanted to sell it. It's how my tax base is established. So when I looked at this individual's property tax statement, which was issued from Miami-Dade County but not Durham, it looked like to me that it was being taxed a lot higher than a wetland. So I first of all called Durham that day with everyone standing there, so we had a lot of witnesses, and talked to the individual that was the person that I guess conducted that evaluation and inspection. And I don't think he understands the concept of Agenda 21. I think they just were people trying to earn a living. Mm-hmm. And I said, how did you assess this? And I said, did you do soil analysis, or did you do an evaluation of the amount of water present or whatever? And basically they didn't do any of that. And I said, well, where do you get your authority? Are you authorized by some statute or power to be to evaluate wetlands and to assess zone usage, the land usage? And he said, well, yeah, we are. And I said, well, let me get back to you. So I had the gentleman's property tax record in my hand, and if I remember right, it was identified by a folio number. That may not be the right term. It's been a year and a half ago. But I called then, and we're all standing there on my cell phone, the Miami-Dade County Property Appraiser's Office. And I get them on the phone, and I ask them, who is entitled to do land use classification? And who collects the taxes? And, well, we do. And I said, well, is there any other authorities in Miami-Dade County that have land use classification authority? No, there's not. And I said, well, have you ever heard of Durham? And she kind of laughs, and she said, yes, I have. And I said, well, they're telling me they can. And she said, no, it's just us. So, and she kind of laughed. I said, have you ever heard this story before? Yes, we hear it quite a bit. So I called the Durham guy back, and he answered the phone, and I said, I just got off the phone with Miami-Dade County Property Appraiser's Office, and they're telling me you do not have land use classification authority, that only they do. Well, then he kind of backtracked and said, well, that's true. So, and I forwarded his story on to the powers in Tallahassee. But, this is kind of where we've got it. I think this is a sovereignty issue. I think it's a land.
So would it be fair to say that in your book, the Forever Florida thing was before you even knew?
I tell people I'm 60 years old, I've made mistakes, and I think there's a statement in the book that says, and as a researcher and in academics, I reserve the right to, upon the presentation of new credible evidence on anything, okay, I'm always willing to reevaluate. And I think that when we did the Florida Forever project here initially, it looked like a good thing. And, I think both parties supported it. I think a lot of public support. But then as time evolves and we start finding what some of the funding lines are and we gain a little more insight, I would not support those funding lines now. Because we don't need people coming in with money from outside. But again, I would love to have gone to a lot of people 2 or 3 years ago and asked them about Florida Forever and see what they said. Because at that point in time, if you were not supporting the environment as far as just being a good steward, people would ask, well, why not? Right. And again, I think that initially that was a concept that had a good meaning. But I think that as it's gone forward and we start discovering some of the funding lines or how some of the funding lines have become, it now is not the same as it was.
Let me switch gears here. I'm
going to say this,
okay,
and I'll let you ask your question.
Okay.
In the U.S. Senate, Florida Forever is a state issue. And, in the U.S. Senate, and we start looking at the constitutional duties of the U.S. Senate, I think that's what this race should be about.
I was just fixing to go there. I was going to ask you to tell me and tell Florida voters, what are the issues that are important for this U.S. Senate seat, and how is it that you think that you can represent the state of Florida better in that seat?
Well, and I think that's a great question. I think what we need to look at is in the U.S. Senate, they have the responsibilities of one, looking out for their state. Every state in the country has 2 U.S. senators. They're elected at large. They serve at large. They represent the state's interest to the federal government. But at the same time, the 100 U.S. senators collectively have to wear a hat that protects our nation. Now, in some ways, those interests should be very common, and in some ways they're not. When you look at the U.S. Senate, for example, only the United States Senate confirms presidential nominations to include senior military officers. Well, that's something that the states don't do. So, when we start looking at the constitutional duties of the U.S. Senate, confirming our senior military leaders, I think that's a huge responsibility. And we have, my understanding is we're down to about 20 veterans or so in the U.S. Senate, yet they're the ones that are confirming our senior military leaders. And I think people ought to have some firsthand understanding of what that is all about, as well as our enemies. When you look at the U.S. Senate ratifying these treaties, I would like to see us do a better job with treaties, because it commits us politically, economically, and militarily. I would like for people to have a serious understanding of national security policy, and how foreign policy needs to protect our vital interest. And a lot of this comes back to what formal and accredited education, training, and professional experience have you had working in these arenas. So, the U.S. Senate's a very unique body. And when I look at what's going on with our country, I think we've had treaties that in the past, including perhaps treaties with the UN, that are not serving our nation's interest. And when you don't serve our nation's interest, you're probably not serving Florida's interest. And at the same time, in the U.S. Senate, you have an agriculture committee. And again, if people want to know what the Senate does, take a look at the constitutional duties of the confirmations, of ratifying the treaties, the U.S. ambassadors, the impact in foreign policy, but look at the committees. Almost, the vast majority of the committees, you have armed services, you have Veterans Affairs, you have agriculture, you have commerce, you have a collection of committees that are business oriented, finance, and et cetera. So, when we start looking at what does a U.S. Senator do, it's like in the job place. We ask people to make a serious hiring decision on election day just like they would in the job place. Yes, we want candidates that we can align with, that have the values that we share. But it's like if you get sick and you're really in trouble, you may know a lawyer that shares your values, but that's not who you're going to go to. Or if you're having a spiritual problem, you're not going to go to your mechanic, even though they may have the mechanic may have shared values. So I think we look for individuals that have shared values that we align with and agree with, but also have, it just so happens that their life's experience, their accredited degrees, their accredited training, their professional experience is in the areas of that position that they are running for office for. And I do not think politics should be a career field. I think every job's unique. And just like in the workplace, we need to look at the job duties and responsibilities and align it with that individual's credentials.
This particular Senate race in the state of Florida has become interesting to me in 2012 because it seems that despite the fact that you have multiple candidates vying for the Republican spot on the general election in November, the media, the party establishment, and even the Tea Party groups that were so vocal and active back in 2010. It seems to me that nobody's talking about candidate Colonel McCalister or candidate Weldon or candidate Long or candidate Stewart. Everything that you see in the media or coming from the party establishment itself has been about Connie Mack. How do you think that that's been fair? Do you think that the other candidates have been given a fair shake in this?
Well, yeah, I think we need to recognize, and I always I try to bring it up when I have an opportunity. There's a reason you can't get an accredited college degree for reading the newspaper and watching the news. They're not peer reviewed. And, we always have to remember that the bulk of the media is for profit. They're in business to make money. So that's what they're going to take a look at. And the fair balance issue may not always be as present in some of the mainstream media as what we would like, both as a candidate, as a party, or whatever. They're going to promote their own interest and agenda because they're in business to make money. So we can't forget that. Now, I can't say all of the media because there's probably some that are non-for-profit. But, when you are a for-profit entity, you're going to do things that are a little bit lean towards that in-state goal. I think with the race, I don't think I would agree that people don't know who I am. We, were number 2 in the polls for a good while. I don't know what the polls are now with one getting out and one getting in. But, as I travel the state, a lot of people know who I am. And, again, when you're trying to run for office, I think it's unfortunate that the candidates, oftentimes are busy throwing mud at each other. And I'm just a big believer that throwing mud on someone else doesn't make you more qualified in any way, shape, or form. And trying to find something on another candidate to take out and say, wow, look at this is what they mean, or this is what this is, that doesn't make you more qualified, and it doesn't solve our problems. I think we need to take a look at what would you do, here's the situation, here's the job requirement, here's the job responsibilities. How does your accredited education, training, and real-world experience fit this? And that's where I feel like we're the best Senate candidate. I can look at those constitutional duties. Do I understand confirming senior military officers? Yes. I was a senior military officer. Oftentimes, it comes back to trying to create mud. You know what I happen to have, and I just got this in the mail about a week ago. One of the things a lot of people were making an issue about on my military record was a DD-214. Well,
And that is, for those of us who don't
exactly.
know.
Here's what it is. So I don't know if you can show the camera on this. The DD-214 is a document that if you have active duty, it just says you were there. And it states what your address was. Try not to get my social security.
Yeah, actually, you know what? I'll tell you what. Why don't you send me a copy of that,
Okay.
and then what I'll do is I'll redact the.
Okay, and what I did, and what happened for me when I had my active duty at U.S. Special Operations Command, they activated me there. At the time, I was a reservist, and then when I deactivated me at the end of the active duty period, I stayed there as a drilling reservist, even though I had at that point like over 30 years about 30 years commissioned service. No, total service. I can only have 30, which is what my end date was related to. But so there was not one published at that time, but me needing one, so I was able to go back, and they had to pull the orders and print the DD-214 that says, yes, I was there. And that's about all it says. But in the meantime, I posted the awards I got during that time. I posted the evaluations of my performance that stated my job duty, my job title, and and they were signed by generals. So this is how the generals that were in supervision over me saw my duty. So we put all of that out there. I got permission to release that. But this document everyone wanted to see, even though it doesn't tell you what your job was, it doesn't tell you how well you did it, it just says you were there.
Okay.
Now we finally got this, and they had to go and pull the orders and publish this document so that people would see there's nothing here
I want to.
that was being withheld. It had
Okay.
just never been made. So, again, I think it comes back to, it seems like in politics, everybody's always looking for something to smear someone or to create doubt in an area. And I would just much rather, as a candidate, say, look, here's who I am, here's my experience, here's my accredited education, here's my professional training, here's where I align with this job the best, and make it a job interview, not a mudslinging contest or a...
Say that you were to win the GOP primary election on August 14th, and you go up against Bill Nelson in the general election. Give me and the voters 3 reasons why you think that you would be capable of beating Bill Nelson and the Democratic machine that would be behind him.
Well, what I'll do is let me just, instead of counting 1, 2, 3,
Okay.
let me just say how I think that's going to go.
Okay, I'm going to have you hold on for 1 second. I'm going to stop this and restart it. All right, we're back.
Yeah, I think that's, first of all, beating Bill Nelson obviously is important as a conservative. I take a look at what is best for our state and our nation. But a lot of people are trying to say, and you were talking earlier about certain groups supporting a certain candidate or whatever. Everyone wants to make it sound like, well, we got to support this Republican candidate because they have the most money to beat Nelson. Well, let's take a look at that. This is an election that no Republican candidate is going to raise more money than Bill Nelson. I do not see that happening. Bill Nelson has already raised somewhere near or approaching $10 million. And he's probably got 4 to 5 times as much as any Republican already. And he will not have a primary or a primary expense. And he's going to start raising money, I believe, at a faster rate. I have been told by the National Party chairman that if I win the primary, I will get the resources that any Republican candidate would get. Because this is an important seat to the National Republican Party as well, and this is a key state. So it's not like some Republicans going to go out and raise a bunch of money to beat Nelson. I don't see it happening. I think that we need to raise all we can, but I think whoever is the Republican candidate is going to have resources above and beyond anything they had during this primary. That's when the big money, in my view, and what I'm perceiving, will come into play. So it comes down to debates. So here's Bill Nelson putting a Republican candidate in a debate. And I know what I would do if I was Bill Nelson, and that's how I would war game this. What would my strategy be if I'm Bill Nelson? Well, there's more registered Democrats in Florida by about 400,000, so I'm going to go after those for sure, get my folks in the voter booth. He has a huge advantage there. 20% of Florida are veterans. The voting public are veterans. We have 1.7 million military veterans. So I'm going to make sure they know that if I'm Bill Nelson, I wore a military uniform, because I want them to understand. I understand them. You know, for me, that's where I think I have, an advantage, because I worked in the Guard, served in the Guard, served in reserve, served in active duty, and all of those have a very common denominator and common mission, but they do have some differences, and I understand all of those. I am retired military. But then I'm going to go to those constitutional duties. Okay, here's what U.S. senators do under the Constitution. They confirm our senior military leaders. They ratify our treaties. They confirm our ambassadors. They confirm our federal judges. Let's look at the committees in the U.S. Senate. Here's the committees you're going to sit on. Does your resume align with this? You got Veterans Affairs. You got Armed Services. You got Agriculture. We start looking down that line. You've got a bunch of business committees there: business, finance, banking, trade, commerce. So I look at my resume. I have a doctorate in business management. I was the lead faculty in a global MBA program for the University of Phoenix ground campuses for several years.
I'm going to interrupt you there for a minute. You might not want to mention the word global,
Okay,
but no, that's actually a joke. Let me ask you something. I want to stop you there because you just mentioned something that I think is extremely important in the primary race. You said that the strategy, if you were Bill Nelson, would be getting a Republican in a debate. Why isn't it important for the Republican candidates in the primary to be involved in a public debate before the Florida voters?
I never said it's not, and you made a good point about the word global. Again, we've learned now that globalization takes us back to one world government, Agenda 21. But if you are running a company that competes around the world, you see global business having nothing to do with the one world government. You want to sell to customers around the world, and again, 95% of the world doesn't live in the United States. So, I can assure you that every morning the president of BMW doesn't get up and ask how many Germans did we hire today, and he didn't get up and say what's happening with Agenda 21, even though I wished he would. He gets up and says how many cars did we sell in the world, and how many did Mercedes sell in the world, and how many did Lexus and Jaguar sell in the world. So, when I say that I taught in an MBA program that was global business, it was global business, not one world government. Okay. So again, that's where they have hid well behind terms that had an accepted meaning before they showed up, which is what they do. It's kind of like a wolf in sheep's clothing. I completed the Command General Staff College. I completed the Air University Air War College, which was one of the best curriculums I ever did. My undergrad degree is in agriculture. So I just feel like that my accredited education and training and professional experience align very well with the constitutional duties and the committees in the U.S. Senate that we are hiring someone to go do.
Okay, I'm gonna have to start pushing this a little faster because the Village Inn gave us access to their facility to do this. I would like to touch back on why are not debates with the Republican primary candidates an important issue, and why are we not seeing a debate with the Republican candidates?
Well, I can't answer that. I know that I was asked to attend several. I went to, over a year ago, the AP did have a Senate forum in St. Pete, and I attended that. There was 4 of us. I'm the only one still in from that day. The AP had a Senate last November in Tallahassee, and I'm the only one that was in then that's still in.
Okay.
Since then, there's been some forums I've attended. You had some candidates that were there, some that couldn't make it. I can't answer for the other campaigns.
Okay, let me try to rephrase that question because I understand these forums. My question is, do you think that all 4 remaining candidates should actually participate in a public debate in front of Florida voters? I do know that the Tampa Bay Times
I was supposed to attend that one.
actually tried to set one up. I know that there's a university or community college within the state of Florida that also tried to set up a televised debate amongst the remaining candidates. Why is it that the Republican candidates at this point have not pushed everyone to participate in one public aired debate before the Florida voters before August 14th?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I can't answer for the other campaigns. I know for me, I would love to be involved in a debate with all the candidates. I think that it would be a great event. I think that it would be good for the Republican Party. It would be good for all the candidates, and I think it certainly would be good for the public. But I'm also going to say that, it's one thing to come to a debate and say things. It's one thing to do an interview and make statements and whatever. But it's just like in the workplace. When you have a job you've advertised, people are going to research your company. They're going to research the job requirements, and they're going to come in prepared to discuss those. But at the end of the day, when you've interviewed several people, we're still before a final hiring decision. We're going to go back to that resume and that interview. Here's what this job is about. Here's the expertise that we need. And I do not believe that you gain the competitive advantage that this country needs and deserves against the other 95% of the world by running a campaign, by doing stump speeches, by reviewing things other people say. It's just like in the workplace. I could come in and tell you all day how I can do this or I can do that, but at the end of the day, you're going to look back and say, but you have no accredited education in this field whatsoever. You have no accredited training in this field whatsoever, and you have very little professional experience in this field.
Okay.
And I think that's what we need to do, is we need to look hard at how people's life history aligns with whatever office they're running in, and every office isn't the same. So we need to do a better job, I think, matching the skill sets and the individual's credentials with what that job is that they're running for.
Okay, tell our viewers and our readers where they can go and actually do that and get more information about you.
Yeah, and I would like to say, sir, I really appreciate your stamina and all this. For the listeners, I will tell you that you and I have been working for a good while where we could be in the same area at the same time, and I really appreciate, just like today, you drove to meet, and you're doing a great service on that. And
I appreciate that.
May not know that. But yeah, we have a website. It's www.MikeMcCalisterForSenate.com.
Okay. And we will put up a link to that with the interview and with the article. On that note, Colonel McCalister, I'd like to thank you for agreeing to the interview and for putting up with my harassing phone calls for the last month. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.